Hey everyone, how are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka Splitsuit, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to talk all about playing kings at full ring. So we're going to talk about playing kings pre-flop and basic strategies there, post-flop strategies there, look at a bunch of different situations and common spots, and kind of talk about how to improve our win rate with this hand. As king should be our second most winning hand in our database, it's very important that we can play this hand as well as possible, and obviously if we have any leaks there, we're able to patch them up as quickly as possible. So we're going to do this in a regular hand history style, which means we are going to use HUD stats and other information to make the best decisions possible. And someone actually suggested in one of the comments that I include hero stats, so we kind of understand what the dynamic is if there would be any. So I'm actually going to do that for this video as well, so the first one we do that. So in this video, hero is going to be a 15-13 with an ATS of 39%, 3-bet of 3%, and fold versus 3-bet of 69%. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, start having some fun, and talk about playing kings. Okay, in this first hand we have kings, face and open from no karma, and hero decides to 3-bet. So first and foremost, no karma is a 24-20 over 1.3k hands, 3-bet of 7%, and fold versus 3-bet of 70%. So definitely not on the nittiest side of the spectrum, and because of that I like Hero's 3-bet. Obviously the 3-bet is strictly for value against someone like that. And my only real nitpick here is the size. I've mentioned this in the past, but my average 3-bet size tends to be around 3x, so at this point at least 4.5. And normally it's going to be somewhere between $4.50 and $5 would be my average 3-bet size here. And again, it's strictly for value, especially against players that are not super nitty. And in this situation, no karma decides to 4-bet. So as a pure default here, I am going to be shoving this for Val. And the reason why I'm doing that is, first and foremost, no karma is definitely aggro, and he's definitely not a super nit. I don't really want to 3-bet this if the only hands that are going to give me action versus my 3-bet crush me. So if he's like a super nit and I 3-bet and he's only going to give me action with kings plus, what's the real point of going for the 3-bet? There's really not any. So make sure you remember that. Don't just 3-bet because lols I have kings. Make sure you look at the whole spot. Make sure you understand what the 3-bet's actually accomplishing, and then make the most plus EV decision from there. So in this situation, I would be shoving mostly because he's aggro. I think that he's doing this with a range wider than just kings plus, which of course I would not do well against. And also he didn't start the hand with a full stack. He only started the hand with give or take around 60 big blinds. So this is someone who I don't think is all that excellent, and because of that I think he's the kind of guy that will make mistakes with things like jacks, queens, ace-king, maybe even ace-queen type hands, maybe even 10s or 9s. So it's a situation where I want to be shoving this strictly for Val, and here's the thing, if he's bad enough to 4-bet hero queens, he's probably going to call it off. So you don't really have to worry about if he is 4-betting that kind of range, him folding versus your 5-bet with it, because there's just really no reason to think that he's going to do that, especially because he's already put in well over a third of his stack. He's put in almost half his stack pre-flop. So this would just be a very easy shove for value for me. But in this situation, hero decides to flat, which kind of makes things a little bit awkward. We have less than 1 SPR, which puts us in commitment, but there of course is always this situation when this happens, and this is just incredibly awkward. And I'm not saying that I shove because I want to alleviate this situation, but I think shoving is profitable, and it also happens to alleviate this situation. But no karma decides to check, and at this point, hero just needs to ask himself, like always, what does a bet accomplish? If he doesn't think that a bet here would get looked up by second best hands, then obviously just check back, try to induce either lighter calls later in the hand or bluffs. And jack on the turn, which of course is not a very good card. Now that jack's part of his range got there, the ace-x part of his range is already there. So if I face a bet here, I'm really not super happy, but no karma decides to check, hero decides to check behind, so I'm cool with everything so far as played post-flop. And river is a 4, no karma, checks, and hero decides to bet $3. So I actually kind of like what Hero's doing here. I think Hero has directly pinpointed no karma's hand at pretty much exactly either 10s or queens, which I would pretty much agree with. If no karma was going to bluff, I think it would have happened already, and if no karma had an ace-x or pocket jacks or a set type hand, I expect that would have bet already as well. So because of that, his check range is either air that has no interest in messing around, or something with the bit of showdown value like tens or queens, in which case this kind of bet should probably be able to get looked up by that being the fact that Hero is giving him roughly 10 to 1. So I can be okay with that, but again, I really don't like the way the pre-flop was played. I think it could have been a little bit sharper. And yeah, it's cool that Hero won this pot, but Hero also probably would have won the extra 16 bucks had he shoved pre-flop, no karma calls, and all of a sudden, look, there's all that extra money for Hero. So make sure you're being disciplined pre-flop, especially against players that are a little aggressive and kind of too aggressive for their own good, and will go for things like 4-bet stack-offs with queens. And oftentimes stack size is indicative of how they're going to do that. Also just general aggression stuff, things like their 3-bet percentage, fold versus 3-bet stats, VPIP, PFR differential, blah, blah, blah. So definitely make sure you're paying attention to all of it, and don't just 3-bet. Just because you have kings, make sure you're thinking about what the 3-bet accomplishes, and then also think about going for 5-betting with kings against players that will take things like ace, king, queens, jacks, tens, whatever, too far pre-flop. Okay, in this next hand we have kings, raised from early position, end up facing a 3-bet from I Hate Money. And I Hate Money is a 15-6 over 439 hands with a 3-bet of 5%. So this is kind of a weird situation, simply because I Hate Money has that really big gap in his VPIP PFR, which usually denotes passivity, but he has a relatively aggressive 3-bet percentage, and also he's 3-betting from the blinds against an early position open, which is usually something that most tighter players don't tend to do too liberally. So it's kind of an awkward situation. We do have some good things in our favor, such as one, that he does have a slightly aggressive 3-bet, also that I Hate Money did start the hand with less than a full stack, roughly only 80 big blinds, so that's always advantageous for us. So in a situation like this, I really don't hate Hero's line of calling here, and the reason why I'm calling here is because I don't think that the 4-bet's really going to accomplish a tremendous amount. If we do 4-bet, is I Hate Money really going to make any mistakes with anything other than exactly kings plus? And unless you think that he is, or that he even, not only that he's going to make the mistake, but that he has enough of those hands in his range that he can make the mistake with, so that he is 3-betting things like ace king and pocket queens, pocket jacks, that sort of stuff, and will stack it off pre-flop, which is kind of tough to say that a tighter player is going to do against an under-the-gun open and 4-bet. So just something to keep in mind. I really don't mind Hero's flat here. Again, just kind of keeping the range, dare I say, as wide as possible, and then just playing poker from there. And this is going to be kind of awkward, roughly 3.5 SPR. It's going to be a little bit feely as far as how you're playing post-flop, but I think Hero can do it, especially with position. So in this situation, I Hate Money bets $4. So we're getting a pretty good price here, a little better than 3 to 1, so I'm totally fine with Hero's call here. I think that Hero is beating some hands, things like pocket queens and c-bets with ace king, so I can be on board with this, and also the times that Hero is behind, at least he has some equity, so that's always good. But really I'm calling this because I expect to be good a fair chunk of the time, or at least enough of the time to justify the call. But again, we are going to have to play poker on turns. And on the turn, we face 550 bet on a queen. Now, the queen is probably one of the worst cards that could have popped off, being that it does fill up now pocket queens, the one hand that we were pretty much beating beforehand. So I'm not really excited about this. The only real hand that we beat at this point is ace king or bluffs, and at this point, is he really going to double barrel a bluff? 1 with that size, 2 on this texture? That's certainly up for debate. So I'm not particularly enamored here. I know that we are getting a decent price. We're getting a little better than 4 to 1, but this is a situation where I really don't mind Hero folding. Now, obviously, I would react in this situation way differently if I Hate Money was a different player, someone who is more aggro, especially someone who's on the fishier side of the spectrum. But even getting this great a price, I don't think that we're going to be good enough to justify this. So if I were Hero, I would just be pushing the fold button here, not really feeling too bad about it at all. But Hero does decide to call, and you notice at this point it's going to be pretty awkward. A pot-sized bet going into the riv, and when Hero faces the shove, it's kind of a weird situation, getting just a pinch better than 2 to 1. However, I think this is actually a much easier fold, simply because I don't think you're good anywhere near enough at the time, especially when you have someone who 3-bet bet the flop, bet the turn, shoves riv, even though the flop and turn sizes were on the smaller side of the spectrum, especially the turn. I just don't really think Hero's good enough at the time against this player type especially. Again, way different if it's against a fish or someone like that, but when it's against one of these tighter, nittier type guys, I just don't think we're going to be good enough at the time. So I do like Hero's discipline pre-flop as far as just calling the 3-bet. I do like the flop call. I do like the river fold. I just don't particularly like the turn call. Again, I don't think we're going to be good enough at the time here, even though we are getting a sick price. And sometimes this is just one of those weird folds we can make against a very specific player type, especially when the board pretty much got as bad as it could have. Okay, in this next hand, we raise with kings, get 3-bet by Mr. Lovely, and we're deciding what we want to do. So Mr. Lovely is a 17-14 over 547 hands, 3-bet of 4%, and fold versus 3-bet of 46%. And Hero decides to call. So kind of the same situation as before. I can totally be on board with calling the 3-bet if we think that we can't 4-bet get it in with an edge. So again, kind of if you 4-bet here and the only hand that gives you action is aces or kings plus, is it really advantageous for you to go for that 4-bet? Not really, because you're kind of taking all the bluff hands and all the stuff that could have paid you off in his 3-bet range and allowing him to play perfectly with it, aka fold versus your 4-bet and then only stack off if it has you crushed, in which case he beats you a ton of the time. So don't be the guy that just automatically default 4-bets with kings pre-flop, especially like in early position confrontations, but even so sometimes in, say, middle position confrontations when they do arise. And also, in this situation, we do have a bit of extra depth, which definitely changes things a pinch. Usually, the deeper you are, the harder it is to try to get kings all in preflop with an edge. So make sure you're being aware of that, especially against competent opponents. So in this situation, we call, and in case that jack-eye flops are very similar to the last one, and we check, and Mr. Lovely decides to bet. So at this point, Hero calls, and I can totally be on board with this, again, making the assumption that we think that Mr. Lovely is 1, 3-betting wide enough, and 2, C-betting wide enough. So I can be on board with that. The only thing we have to remember is that it is going to get a little bit awkward on turns. Again, we're still going to have to play the feel game, and this is just kind of one of those things that happens when you call 3-bets. Sometimes you're just left in that I have to get in there and feel it out type situation, and obviously that's always a lot harder to do out of position, as the case is. So definitely make sure you're aware of that and be cautious against very competent opponents. So 7 on the turn, Hero checks, and Mr. Lovely checks behind. So when Mr. Lovely checks behind, I'm feeling much more confident about my hand. I expect to have the best hand here a very, very large chunk of the time. I think most tag to laggy type players would be betting the turn for Val with their overpairs, especially aces. So I'm in a very, very comfortable situation where I think that he's either checking back, 1, a bluff that he doesn't want to bluff anymore, or 2, checking back something with some amount of showdown value. Whether that be something like an 8x type hand, a jack x type hand, a pocket 10s type hand, whatever it be, I expect that I'm good a fair chunk of the time, and I'm going to be approaching the river with that mentality. So when the river bricks off the 5, I'm kind of in a bet mode, and I'm betting because, 1, I don't think that Mr. Lovely is going to bluff, because if he was going to bluff, why wouldn't he have bluffed the turn? There's no real reason to think that he's going to bluff the riv. So because of that, I'm in a situation where I don't think checking generates any value against the bluff part of his range. And also I'm betting because there's no guarantee that he's going to bet the showdown value part of his range. Like I said, the 8x type stuff, maybe the jack x type stuff. There's no guarantee he's going to bet that himself. So the bet kind of allows him to call with those, whereas checking he doesn't really make any mistakes if we do decide to check to him. So I'm very okay with making this kind of bet. Size is just fine, roughly around half-ish pot. If you thought you can get it away for bigger, cool, but otherwise I have no problem with this kind of size. And we do end up getting looked up by, I think, Sticky Jack. Yeah, so that's always good for business. So I would definitely note that Mr. Lovely did 3-bet me in position with a Jack-9 suited from a hijack to the cutoff. I would also note that he played it with showdown value on the turn. He didn't bet his Jack-no kicker on the turn. So these are some things that I would use against him in the future. 1, I just kind of have an idea on his 3-bet range. Not necessarily exactly what it looks like, but at least that he is getting active with bluff 3-bets. And then also kind of what his post-flop mentality is. So if I see that turn check, I have a better idea on what it might be. And also if he bets the turn in the future, changes the way that I might think that he's weighting his range as far as is it going to be stronger or is it going to be weaker. So definitely make sure you're paying attention to those kind of notes. And overall, I think Hero played this hand very, very well. I like pre-flop, I like the flop, I like the turn and riv. So everything looks really, really sharp. Sizes look good. So overall, I'm very happy. And this is, again, kind of just one of those awkward spots that comes up sometimes at full ring when you can't 4-bet kings for value and you have to call that 3-bet. Again, sometimes you have to play post-flop and it can be awkward out of position, but just kind of think about what his actions are telling you and make the best decisions you can from there. Okay, in this next hand, Aardvark opens, Flushing calls, and Hero decides to squeeze. So Aardvark here is a total unknown. We have no stats on him, and Flushing is a 28-11 over 111 hands, 3-bet of 3%, and fold versus 3-bet of 0%. So as a pure default, I like the squeeze. It's obviously strictly for value, especially with that fishy guy in there, so totally good with that. Hero did decide to pot it here, and as a size, I'm okay with that. I also have nothing wrong with going to pinch larger, something like $7 or $7.25. So again, strictly for value, especially with a fishy guy in there who you know is going to make plenty of pre-flop calling mistakes. I have no problem with just pinching out a little bit of extra value now because, well, why not? But in this situation, Hero does squeeze, Aardvark folds, and Flushing calls. Go heads up to it, and we catch that awful, awful flop, which we know is going to happen sometimes. So in a situation like this, Hero decides to check behind, and I can be okay with a check, especially if Hero doesn't think that the bet would accomplish anything. But if Hero thought that he could bet here and get looked up by pretty much everything, any pair that's, just everything kings and under, then I can totally be on board with a bet with intentions of checking back turns and probably checking back a fair chunk of ribs. That can be a decent thing. If you think that the bet just won't accomplish anything, that it's only going to get looked up by better hands, it's really not folding out. Obviously you're not in a bluff mode here, so we're not worried about what we're folding out. What we're just really worried about is generating value. And if the bet will get value from crappy pairs and stupid calls by flushing, then by all means go for the bet. If you don't think it's going to or you're unsure, I have nothing wrong with just checking it behind and essentially just playing poker out. You can induce some bluffs on the turn, which is great. You can also induce some lighter check calls, which is always great. But as far as whether I bet or check the flop is really dependent on what I think that bet is going to accomplish. And the fishier that person is, the more likely I am to try to go for val. If they're really bluffy, the more likely I am to check behind here to try to induce, that sort of thing. But we do check behind, 8 on the turn, and Flushing decides to pot it. And Hero decides to call. So I don't particularly like Hero's call here. One, we're not getting a good price here. We're only getting 2 to 1. Which means we have to be good a fair chunk of the time to justify this call. And it's not like the ace plus this bet size means that he doesn't have an ace. It's not like it's unlikely that we're behind, being that he is a fishy guy. Fish love to call ace x crap pre-flop, both to raises and 3-bets for whatever reason. So it's likely that he has a hand that beats us here. It's definitely not unreasonable. And also, if we call here, look at the size of the pot. The pot's already 45 going in the riv, only 30 back in the effective stack, so we're going to be getting even better price than we were on the turn call on the riv. And do we really want to do that? And are we expecting to be good enough at the time? And if we're only calling to catch a king, obviously that's incredibly bad. If we think that we're good a lot of the time, then when we do see the riv and face that bet, then it's probably a situation where we're snapping it off. And I don't like doing that against fishy guys, and especially not fishy guys like this, who really doesn't have a very aggro 3-bet. He has a pretty large gap in the VPIP PFR. He did call an open raise preflop and then call a squeeze, and then all of a sudden gets potty on the turn. And I don't really like when he starts pottying it on the turn. I don't think I'm doing very good in that situation. And it's way different if the turn size is smaller, we're getting a better price, whatever it be, we have some other info, fine. But in a situation where we see the turn like that and face this potter, I really have nothing wrong with just folding here. I don't think this is going to be a profitable call for Hero without information that he can call the riv profitably. So otherwise, I'm totally fine with preflop. I'm totally fine with the flop, but I think the turn needs to be a fold. At least Hero found the fold button on the riv, which I think is fine. But again, I think this hand could have been played a little bit better by being a pinch more disciplined on that turn versus that pot-sized bet. Okay, in this hand we have kings face a raise from F the IRS. Hero decides to 3-bet, and FTIRS is a 17-13 over 88 hands with a fold versus 3-bet of 50%. So in this situation, the 3-bet is strictly for value. I like the fact that FTRS has a lower fold versus 3-bet, although we really shouldn't read too far into that simply because that could easily be out of only 2 samples, possibly 4. So I don't want to read into that too much, but by the same token, he looks to be active. I have kings, so as a default, I'm just going to be 3-betting this for val and not feeling bad at all. FTRS decides to call, and we end up flopping top set out of position. So that's always fun. And Hero decides to lead for 7. So I can totally be on board with the lead for 7. The smaller size can induce a bunch of stuff. It can induce a wider call range, so maybe he decides not to fold his 9s, 10s, jacks, queens type stuff, which I'm happy about. It can also induce some bluff raises. Maybe he'll look at it and say, well, that doesn't look real enough, so I'm going to turn some things into bluffs. Obviously happy with that. I have no problem considering checking here, especially if we thought that the check could induce a lot of bluffs, or especially a lot of like dubs or trips. I can totally be on board with that. Otherwise, I have nothing wrong with just kind of leading out with this smaller size and trying to induce. And obviously, I don't expect to get action a ton of the time. It's kind of difficult too, being that I kind of have all the good cards in the deck, but by the same token, I don't mind doing this in general. And I would also take a note. So if FTIRS folded to this, then I would take a note that this is the kind of guy who I might be able to 3-bet, C-bet on these kind of boards and generate a lot of folds. So I might start doing that with my bluff hands pre-flop, because now I have an extra way of knowing how I can make money post. That's always good for business. So I would definitely make sure that I'm noting kind of the way he reacts in a situation, especially on these boards where it's ace-high boards, king-high boards, that kind of stuff. And I note it when I have top set, I note it when I have top pair, I note it when I have nothing. And that way I can start generating some real ideas on how I want to attack that person in the future. But FTIRS decides to call, and 8 on the turn, and Hero checks. So I can be on board with Hero checking here. I think it's kind of difficult to get 3 streets of value if we bet here. Simply from the kind of range like 9s through queens, I don't think we're always going to get 3 streets from that. So checking does a couple things. One, allows FTIRS to bluff, which is always good if we think that he's the kind of guy that would float that flop a lot of the time. It's obviously great for us. And it's also good if it's a situation where if we bet here, he'd fold something like, say, jacks, but if we check here, either he'll make a betting mistake or he'll make a river calling mistake if we check the turn, so that can always be good for business as well. So make sure you're considering kind of, again, what your bets and raises accomplish, and if checks can induce more mistakes, then obviously look to do a little bit more checking. FTIRS actually does decide to oblige us with a bet here, which is always good for business, and Hero decides to go for this just over check min raise. So I don't particularly like the check min raise or this size either, and I'll tell you why. There's roughly 3 different parts of FTIRS's range here. There's the bluff parts, there's the stuff like ace king, which we're always going to get money from, and then there's the other stuff like pocket jacks. So if we go for this smallish check raise, are we really going to get any action from the jack or the pocket jacks part of his range? And I'd say probably not. I mean, yeah, okay, I'm not saying that the size itself might not look bluffy, because we're essentially giving her, if this were a bluff, it'd be a really doesn't need to work too often type bluff, so I'm happy about that. But by the same token, do we have that level of history with this player? We only have 88 hands against him, so I would venture a guess that we do not have that level of history nor dynamic, and thus I'm not going to try to read into anything too much. And because of that, I'm kind of playing in a more straightforward, more default mindset. So in a situation like this, I don't think I need to do anything crazy to get value from jacks and stuff. I think it's going to be difficult to get value from that anyway, but by the same token, I don't think the check min raise is going to get nut value from that. Now, if he has the bluff part of his range, is the check min raise really going to do too much? Is it really going to induce a light 5-bet or anything like that? I'd venture probably not, or not very often at all. So against the bluff stuff, I'm actually a little bit happier just check call here and hope to induce some sort of bluff on the riv. That's better for me. And then if FTIRS does have the big part of his range, a weird set or ace king, well, we're going to get that stack regardless, kind of whether we check raise here or whether we go for the check call here. So I'm kind of in a mode where I don't think the check raise really does too much. Again, I think it kind of shuts off the bluffs. I think it can generate some folds from maybe queens or jacks type hand that might do something silly if we had otherwise just called here. So as a default, I would just call and in this situation go for a check call and try to induce. I think inducing is going to be a bit more valuable than going for this, because again, if he has ace king, we were going to get that money anyway, regardless of what we did on the turn. Whereas by check raising, okay, yes, we get value from ace king, but we think we miss some value from, again, the pair part of his range that isn't on the king, and also the bluff part of his range. So make sure that you're considering that when you're thinking about your line creation on the turn, and kind of think about what are the basic parts of his range. How do I think they weight? Is it going to be heavily ace king? Is it going to be very heavily weighted towards bluffs, whatever it is? And then think about how you can maximize value against that. Again, looking at all your lines and bet rationale, but also, again, just kind of thinking about how you can maximize value. And if the raise is not the best play, it isn't optimal, probably look to do something else. Okay, in this next hand, sit and go grinder raises, midnight calls, and hero decides to squeeze. So in this situation, sit and go grinder is a 41-20 over 67 hands, fold first 3-bet at 0%, so obviously fishy. And midnight is a 13-8 over 1k hands, 3-bet of 2%, and fold first 3-bet of 79%. So in this situation, I like the squeeze, obviously really trying to attack sit and go grinder, which means that I'd probably like the squeeze to be, again, just a pinch larger. $7 I think would have been totally fine, totally for value against that sort of player. But in this situation, the fish actually folds and the nit tag decides to call. So we end up catching this board. This board is really, really awful. And it's pretty awful because if you think about Midnight's fold versus 3-bet percentage, which is pretty high over a sample size that's usable, so when he calls that squeeze, yes, he does have positions, so okay, maybe he calls a pinch lighter, but in all actuality, this kind of board should be all over his face. I mean, it's probably a situation where he's not going to be 3-betting things like queens and tens pre-flop, even against the fishy guy, especially with that low 3-bet percentage. So it's a spot where he should really be all over this board, and yes, obviously things like sevens and sixes, whatever, probably don't, they obviously don't hit the board, but we're not going to get any value from them anyway. But hero decides to bet. So I want to talk about this. So I don't think that the bet is great here. If we bet, what does the bet accomplish? Well, we're never going to fold out a better hand, obviously. And are we getting calls from very many worse hands? And I'd say probably not a tremendous amount of them, simply because the sevens and down really aren't going to pay us off. And the only other part of his range that can really make a mistake is pocket jacks, pocket nines, and ace queen if it's even in his range. So it's a situation where there's not very many of those hands, and yes, there's only 9 combinations of sets, but by the same token, I don't think he makes mistakes with many of the other things in his range. If we bet here, I don't even think that jacks will always continue. I don't think that nines will always continue. Obviously jacks would continue more than nines as a general, but I don't even expect to get very many calls from either of those hands. So because of that, we're kind of in a situation where the bet kind of lets Midnight play really close to perfect, and obviously that's something I don't really want to do. I'm not generating any value, I'm just letting him pretty much screw me when I'm behind, and then I make nothing when I'm ahead, so kind of where's the motivation to make this bet? So I'm in a situation here where I would actually rather check, make a decision, as opposed to lead here. And I do say check, make a decision, because there are situations where I will consider folding against his bet, especially if it's on the bigger side of the spectrum, and I don't think he would make that bet size with a bluffy hand, and thus it weights more towards sets than it does anything else. But in a situation like this, I just really don't think the bet accomplishes much. I think here would have been much better just checking and making a decision as opposed to this. And then once Midnight decides to raise, you have someone who's just playing super nitty. He decides to raise you on this board. You are just never, ever good. Because he would never raise here with ace-queen. He wouldn't raise here with jacks and try to semi-bluff you. So his range is really only ace-king, which just does very, very well equity-wise. Ace-king of clubs, sorry. And then the other stuff, which of course is just sets, which all screw us. So this is a situation where Hero, I think, could have played this a lot better, and then Hero decides to shove, and of course is only running into this kind of hand. So again, I think Hero could have played this a lot better. It would not have been too difficult to do so. Again, a little bit of discipline, a little bit more thinking about what does my bet accomplish on that flop, and then really thinking about, who is my opponent, what kind of mistakes do I think he's going to make, and then if you do decide to make the mistake of betting against that particular player, very, very easy situation to fold versus that min raise, because again, it's just never a bluff, or at least nowhere near enough of the time. Okay, in this last hand, Time Bank open limps, and Hero decides to ISO. And Time Bank is a 42-0 over 32 hands, so Time Bank is definitely shaping up to be a very passive fish type player. And because of that, I'd actually like Hero's ISO to be a pinch larger here, probably something like 250 to 275, simply because Time Bank is shaping up to be the kind of guy that needs to see every single flop. So let's make sure we really hammer him for that, and don't take any mercy against players like that. Make sure you go for that little bit of extra value pre-flop, especially when they just want to give it to you. But Time Bank calls, as we expected, 10 high flop, and Time Bank decides to donk out for $2, and Hero decides to just flat. So I don't particularly like Hero's flat here, and I'll tell you why. There are, roughly in my opinion, 3 different parts of Time Bank's donk range, the likely stuff. The one is things like top pair, so things like ace 10, king 10, whatever it be. There is also going to be weakish pairs, so things like pocket sixes or 5x, and then there's going to be drawy type stuff in my opinion, so things like flush draws or straight draws. I'm not saying that there's not much in terms of bluff, but I wouldn't expect a player like this to do a tremendous amount of bluffing, so I think his range is going to contort way more towards one of those 3 parts of range. And because of that, I think if I raise, I'm going to nut value here way more often than not, simply because if he's bad enough to donk here with even say something like 6s or 7s, what's to say that he's not going to call a raise with it, especially when the board is quote-unquote so safe for him in a brick days king, and we all know how fish think about boards just in terms of that. So there's definitely that, and also I don't want to let bad cards start rolling off. If he has something like say 10x, do I really want to let an overcard roll off that slows him down? Do I want to let a diamond roll off that slows him down? If he has a draw, and this is the kind of guy that would make a lot of mistakes here with draws, and if he's bad enough to donk it, I would assume that he's probably going to do some bad stacking off, then this is the kind of spot where I really want to raise, and again, strictly for value. So if I were going to raise here, I'd probably just raise to something like 950, a little bit on the larger side of the spectrum, close to pot, but really it's just strictly for val. I want to get money in here. His donk range I think is going to be very, very favorable for me raising here, and I expect to get stacks in here a very large percentage of the time. Whereas when I call, I can let awful turn cards roll off, which slow things down, and obviously that's something I never want to do against someone who would give me money right now. But we catch this beautiful deuce in the turn, Time Bank decides to bet, and Hero raises, which I'm happy about the raise. I just don't like the size. I think the size is way too small. I think this really needs to be a shove as played. Again, I think the flop should have been a raise, but here, this needs to be just a raise strictly for val. Again, kind of the same thought process as far as his donk range and also the kind of bad cards that could shut him down. Like, I would really hate for him to just call $5 here, have an awful Riv card come off, and then all of a sudden I don't get the extra, 9.1 worth of value that I kind of need and want. So it's important that we're always making sure we hammer every penny of value from those fish, and it's just kind of criminal not to. So in a situation like this, I really want to just go for the shove as played, if not flop raise. It's always nice that Time Bank decided to raise for us, so obviously snap it. But again, I think Hero's line could have been a little bit better had he kind of really thought about the kind of donk range that Time Bank's likely to use, and also really thinking about future action as far as if a bad card comes off, is it really going to be am I going to be able to make nut value off of it, or am I going to possibly leave value on the table? So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Again, we looked at a collection of hands with pocket kings played at full ring, and I think a lot of these hands are very, very useful and covered a lot of the common situations. We covered things like, should we 3-bet or not? How do we want to react against a 3-bet? Do we want to default 4-bet or not? Also talked about how to play post-flop, both in single raise pots and 3-bet pots, and also squeeze pots. And it's important that we know how to play all those situations. They come up commonly because kings are the kind of hand that we're almost always going to play pre-flop. So it's important that we know how to handle situations with them. So with that being said, I mean, if you kind of go through some of these hands again, look at them and think about, okay, what were we thinking about? What was the, dare I say, mental checklist we were using, and how were we creating lines based upon that? I think that can help you with all the other sort of king spots that do come up commonly. And it's, again, important that we can play this hand well, as a lot of our win rate is derived from how we play kings and what our win rate is with kings. So it's important that we're constantly patching leaks and playing kings better and better, and making sure that we're maximizing value against fish, and we're playing it as best as possible against regs and tags and those kind of players. So same as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Otherwise, good luck out there, happy grinding, and good luck playing kings.